The November rain hammered coastal shipyards' windows like angry fists. Aaron Walsh, still in his wrinkled dress shirt from the company party, watched Margaret Flynn crumble against the executive table. The Iron Lady of Human Resources, who'd never shown a crack in her armor, was mumbling incoherently about bleeding colors. Her trembling hand gripped his calloused wrist with desperate strength, leaving behind something that made his blood freeze. A streak of cobalt blue paint, fresh paint, on the hands of a woman who worked with spreadsheets, not art. As Aaron guided her unsteady steps toward his battered pickup truck, Margaret's designer purse spilled open, revealing secrets that would shatter everything he thought he knew. But first, he had to get her home safely. What he would discover when she woke up would change both their lives forever. Aaron had worked at Coastal Shipyard for 8 long years, welding steel hulls under the harsh Maine sun. His hands told the story of countless burns and cuts, each scar a testament to the honest work that kept food on the table for him and his 9-year-old son, Ethan. The roughness of his palms contrasted sharply with the gentle way he braided his boy's hair each morning, a ritual he'd learned from YouTube videos after his wife died. 3 years had passed since the accident that claimed Sarah's life, leaving him to navigate single parenthood in their small trailer home on the edge of Maplewood. The boy had been born with a hole in his heart, a defect that required careful monitoring and would eventually need surgery that Aaron's basic insurance barely covered. Every night, he listened to Ethan's breathing, counting the steady rhythm that sometimes skipped or fluttered in ways that made Aaron's own heart race with terror. Dr. Rebecca Hayes had been cautiously optimistic during their last appointment, but the unspoken timeline hung heavy between them. Surgery within the year, costs that would bankrupt most families, and the constant fear that time might run out before Aaron could figure out how to save his son. Margaret Flynn had been his boss for 5 years, a woman who commanded respect through sharp intelligence and an even sharper tongue. She wore her authority like armor, gray suits that never wrinkled, hair pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch her skin tight, glasses that reflected rather than revealed. No one at the shipyard had ever seen her smile genuinely, let alone stumble drunk at a company party. Aaron had always assumed she lived alone in the Victorian house overlooking the harbor, as cold and untouchable as the lighthouse that guided ships safely home. Her interactions with employees were brief, professional, and completely devoid of warmth. The drive through Maplewood's empty streets felt surreal, like traveling through a snow globe someone had shaken too hard. Margaret slumped against the passenger window, occasionally muttering words Aaron couldn't understand. Something about colors bleeding, about shadows that moved wrong, about hands that remembered what minds tried to forget. Her breath fogged the glass in irregular patterns, and every few minutes she'd press her palm against the window as if trying to leave handprints in the condensation. When they reached her house, she fumbled for her keys with shaking hands, the cobalt paint still vivid under her fingernails, like evidence of a crime she couldn't quite remember committing. Aaron helped her to the door, steadying her elbow as she swayed on unsteady legs. The Victorian house loomed above them, its gingerbread trim dark against the storm clouds, windows reflecting nothing but blackness. For a moment, their eyes met in the amber glow of the porch light, and he saw something he'd never witnessed before in Margaret Flynn's face. Fear. Raw, vulnerable fear, like a child caught hiding something precious and terrible. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, to explain or apologize or warn him, but instead she just shook her head slowly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain drumming on the porch roof. Her hand found his briefly, squeezing with surprising strength before she pulled away. You're a good man, Aaron Walsh." Then she disappeared behind the heavy oak door, leaving Aaron standing in the storm with more questions than answers, swirling in his mind like the wind-driven rain. He drove home through the darkness. The image of that blue paint burned into his memory, along with the way her voice had cracked when she said his name. The next morning arrived grey and cold, typical for late November in Maine, with frost covering his truck windshield in delicate patterns that reminded Aaron of the lace curtains his grandmother used to make. He was making breakfast for Ethan when a knock echoed through their small trailer, sharp and purposeful. Aaron wiped his hands on a dish towel, wondering who would visit so early, and opened the door to find Margaret Flynn standing on his makeshift porch. She looked nothing like the executive he knew. Faded jeans that had seen better years, a cream-colored sweater with a small hole near the left elbow, her hair loose around her shoulders and catching the morning light like spun silver. Without the armor of her business attire, she seemed smaller, more human somehow, like a person playing dress-up who'd finally been allowed to take off the costume. Her face was pale but clean of last night's makeup, revealing freckles across her nose that Aaron had never noticed before. She held a small paper bag in her hands, gripping it like a lifeline. "I wanted to thank you properly for last night," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes avoiding his direct gaze. I don't usually drink like that. Actually, I don't usually drink at all." Aaron invited her in, watching as she took in the modest surroundings, without the judgment he'd expected from someone who lived in a Victorian mansion. The trailer was clean, but cramped, every inch utilized out of necessity rather than choice. Photos of Ethan and his late mother lined the narrow hallway, Sarah's smile bright and warm in every frame, her arms around their son at various ages, her eyes full of the life that had been cut short too soon. Margaret's gaze lingered on these photos with an expression Aaron couldn't quite identify, something between longing and recognition. In the corner of the living room, Aaron's amateur metal sculptures occupied a small table, twisted pieces of scrap steel he'd welded together during sleepless nights when grief and worry made rest impossible. They weren't much to look at, really, just the result of restless hands needing something to do while his mind processed fears too big for words. Some looked like birds attempting flight, others resembled abstract flames reaching toward an invisible sky. Ethan called them Daddy's Dragons and had named each one, creating elaborate stories about their adventures in the scrapyard kingdoms he invented during their bedtime conversations. Ethan burst from his bedroom like a whirlwind, all boundless energy despite the heart condition that would slow him down eventually. His pajamas were dinosaur-printed and slightly too small, but he refused to give them up despite Aaron's attempts to buy new ones. "Dad, is this the lady from your work?" he asked, studying Margaret with the unfiltered curiosity of childhood, his head tilted to one side like a puppy considering a new toy. There was no shyness in the boy, just genuine interest in this stranger who'd appeared at their breakfast table. Margaret knelt to his eye level, and Aaron watched something magical happen. A genuine smile broke across her face for the first time he could remember. It transformed her completely, erasing years of practiced coldness and revealing the woman she might have been in a different life. "I'm Margaret," she said softly, her voice taking on a gentleness Aaron had never heard in 5 years of workplace interactions. "Your dad was very kind to me last night, when I wasn't feeling well." Her hand moved as if to ruffle the boy's hair, then stopped halfway, uncertain whether such familiarity was welcome. Ethan, blessed with the social fearlessness of youth, launched into an enthusiastic description of his father's metal creations. He dragged Margaret to the corner table, chattering about dragons that fly when the wind hits them just right, and robots that dance if you squint your eyes and use your imagination. His small hands moved expressively as he spoke, painting pictures in the air of the stories these simple sculptures had inspired. Margaret listened with complete attention, asking questions that showed she understood the difference between looking at art and truly seeing it. Margaret's attention fixed on the sculptures with an intensity that surprised Aaron, her fingers hovering inches above the welded seams as if she could feel their energy without touching. She walked around the table slowly, examining each piece from different angles, her head moving in small, unconscious nods of approval. "These are extraordinary," she murmured, her voice filled with something Aaron had never heard from her before, genuine awe. "You have a natural understanding of form and movement. The way you've captured motion in static metal, it's remarkable." Aaron felt heat rise in his cheeks, embarrassment and pride warring in his chest, like two dogs fighting over the same bone. He wasn't used to praise, especially not from someone who moved in circles where people actually knew about art. "They're just scrap metal," he said, his voice gruffer than he'd intended. "Something to keep my hands busy when I can't sleep. Nothing special, really." He shoved his hands into his pockets, suddenly aware of the permanent grease under his fingernails, the way his work clothes hung loose on his frame. But Margaret shook her head firmly, her eyes bright with something he couldn't identify. Passion, maybe, or recognition of a kindred spirit. "Art isn't about expensive materials or fancy galleries," she said, kneeling again to examine a piece that resembled a phoenix rising from twisted metal flames. "It's about seeing beauty where others see waste, about finding meaning in the discarded pieces of life. These sculptures, they tell stories. They breathe. That's more than most gallery pieces accomplish with 100 times the budget." "Would you like to have dinner with us sometime?" Aaron found himself asking, the words surprising him as much as they seemed to surprise her. They tumbled out before his logical mind could stop them, born from some deeper instinct that recognized something precious and rare in this moment. Margaret's smile faltered slightly, replaced by that same fearful look from the night before, as if happiness was a luxury she couldn't afford to indulge. Her hands, which had been relaxed while examining his art, clenched into small fists at her sides. "I'd like that," she said carefully, each word chosen with the precision of someone walking through a minefield. "But I should warn you. I'm not very good company. I don't know how to be around people anymore. Not real people, anyway." There was something heartbreaking in her admission, a loneliness so profound it made Aaron's chest ache in sympathy. As she prepared to leave, fumbling with the paper bag she'd brought, Ethan called out from behind them. "Dad, why does the lady have sad eyes?" The question hung in the air like morning mist, innocent and devastating in its accuracy. Children saw things adults learned to ignore, looked past the masks people wore to the truth underneath. Margaret heard him and paused at the door, her hand trembling slightly on the handle like a leaf in a strong wind. She turned back to Aaron with an expression he couldn't quite read. Part gratitude, part terror, part desperate hope. "Sunday dinner, then," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll cook. Fair warning, I'm terrible at it. Haven't had much practice cooking for anyone but myself." She paused, seeming to gather courage for what came next. "And Aaron, bring some of your metal work. I'd like to see more of what you create when you think no one's watching." The way she said it made Aaron wonder if she understood something about creating in solitude that he'd never put into words. Sunday evening found Aaron and Ethan standing before Margaret's Victorian house, a canvas bag of his sculptures clutched in Aaron's nervous hands like a schoolboy carrying his first art project. The house seemed different in the golden light of early evening, less forbidding, more like a beautiful woman who'd forgotten how to smile, but still remembered how to dream. Gingerbread trim caught the sunset in intricate shadows, and warm light spilled from windows that had seemed cold and empty just days before. Margaret answered the door in casual clothes again, dark jeans that actually fit her properly, and a soft blue sweater that brought out the color of her eyes. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and she'd traded her severe glasses for contacts that revealed the true shape of her face. The smell of something burning drifted from the kitchen behind her, and she laughed, a sound Aaron realized he'd never heard before, rich and genuine, and slightly embarrassed. "I warned you about my cooking," she said, leading them inside with a gesture that seemed more natural than her usual precise movements. The interior was a study in contradictions that fascinated Aaron's artist's eye. Expensive furniture, a leather sofa that probably cost more than his truck, an antique dining table that gleamed with old-world craftsmanship, sat beside clearly handmade pieces that spoke of different values. A simple wooden stool beside the fireplace, painted in cheerful yellows and blues. A quilt draped over an armchair, its pattern telling stories of patient hands and long evenings spent in quiet creation. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with everything from business texts to art history volumes, poetry collections wedged between manuals on metalworking and color theory. But it was the absence that struck Aaron most powerfully. No personal photos on the mantelpiece, no mementos from travels or achievements, nothing that spoke of a life lived fully or relationships cherished. The house felt like a beautiful museum where the curator had forgotten to include the most important exhibits, the evidence of human connection, of joy shared and memories made. It was the home of someone who existed rather than lived, who'd built walls so high that even she couldn't see over them anymore. The dining room table was set for 3 with care that touched Aaron's heart. Cloth napkins instead of paper, candles flickering despite the early hour. A small vase holding wildflowers that must have come from the overgrown garden he'd glimpsed behind the house. Ethan was enchanted by everything, his head swiveling like an owl as he took in the chandelier, the oil paintings on the walls, the way sound echoed differently in rooms with high ceilings and hardwood floors. "It's like a castle," he whispered to Aaron, his eyes wide with wonder. Dinner was indeed a disaster in culinary terms. The chicken was dry enough to qualify as jerky, the vegetables had been cooked into submission, and the homemade bread could have doubled as a weapon. But the conversation flowed like wine, rich and warming despite the mediocre food. Margaret asked Ethan about school with genuine interest, wanting to know about his favorite subjects and which kids he played with at recess. When the topic turned to his heart condition, she listened without the pity or discomfort most adults showed, treating it as simply another fact about him rather than something that defined his worth. "The doctors say I might need surgery soon," Ethan said matter-of-factly, cutting his chicken with the serious concentration he applied to all tasks. "But I'm not scared. Dad says brave people aren't the ones who don't feel fear. They're the ones who feel scared but do what needs doing anyway." He looked up at Margaret with the direct gaze of childhood. "Are you brave? You seem like you might be scared of something, but you're here anyway." Margaret's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and Aaron saw her swallow hard before answering. "I think bravery is something you have to practice," she said carefully. "Like playing piano or learning to ride a bicycle. Some days you're better at it than others." She leaned forward slightly, meeting Ethan's curious gaze with unusual directness. "But being here with you and your father, this is the bravest I've felt in a very long time." After dinner, Margaret led them to a workshop behind the house that Aaron hadn't noticed during his previous visits. It was housed in what had once been a carriage house, its brick walls and timber frame speaking of an era when craftsmanship was valued over speed. The space had been converted with obvious care and considerable expense. Professional lighting, climate control, and metalworking equipment that made Aaron's mouth water with envy. Torches, anvils, sheets of various alloys organized with military precision. This wasn't the hobby setup of a weekend warrior. This was a serious artist's laboratory. "I dabble," Margaret said with studied casualness. But Aaron's trained eye saw through the understatement immediately. The tools were expensive and well-maintained, the workspace organized with the efficiency of someone who spent serious time creating. Her work occupied several tables throughout the space, technically perfect pieces that showcased advanced skill and understanding of metallurgy. Abstract sculptures that played with light and shadow, jewelry that looked like it belonged in high-end galleries, decorative panels that could have graced museum walls. But as impressive as her technical skill was, Aaron noticed something missing from her creations, the raw emotion that drove his own midnight welding sessions. Her pieces were beautiful, certainly, but they felt calculated rather than born from necessity. They spoke to the mind, but not to the heart, like perfect sentences in a language she'd learned, but never truly made her own. She handled his amateur sculptures with reverence that bordered on worship, her fingers tracing the rough welds and imperfect joints as if they contained secrets she'd forgotten how to access. "You see the soul in the metal," she said quietly, holding up one of his pieces to catch the workshop light. It was one of his favorites, a small figure that looked like it was reaching for something just beyond its grasp, created on a night when missing Sarah had threatened to drown him in memories. "That's a gift that can't be taught in any school. I have all the technical knowledge in the world, but I lost the ability to put heart into my work somewhere along the way." Sparathan, growing tired from the excitement of the day, curled up on a workshop chair that Margaret had cushioned with what looked like an expensive throw blanket. His eyelids drooped as the adults continued talking in lowered voices, their conversation taking on the intimate quality that emerges when people feel safe enough to share their real thoughts. Aaron and Margaret moved around the workshop like dancers who'd rehearsed together, examining pieces, discussing techniques, sharing stories of creative frustration and unexpected breakthroughs. She told him about the burden of managing people's livelihoods, the weight of decisions that affected entire families in a town where good jobs were scarce and precious. "Every layoff is someone's mortgage payment," she said, her voice heavy with responsibility. "Every budget cut is a child's college fund disappearing. People think management is about power, but really it's about carrying everyone else's fears along with your own." Aaron heard the loneliness in her words, the isolation that came with being the person who had to make hard choices while remaining professionally distant from their human cost. He spoke of the crushing fear that came with raising a sick child alone, of loving someone so much it physically hurt to imagine losing them. "Some nights I just sit outside his room listening to him breathe," Aaron admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "Counting each breath like prayer beads, terrified that one night the rhythm will change in a way I can't fix." He talked about the guilt of working overtime to pay medical bills while missing school plays and bedtime stories, the impossible mathematics of single parenthood, where time and money always fell short of need. The conversation felt dangerous in its intimacy, crossing lines that employer and employee shouldn't cross, venturing into territory that could change everything between them. But in the workshop surrounded by metal and dreams, those boundaries seemed less important than the recognition passing between two people who'd learned to carry heavy burdens alone. Margaret's questions were perceptive and gentle, drawing out details Aaron had never shared with anyone. Her understanding came from experience rather than sympathy. She knew what it meant to feel responsible for others' well-being. As they prepared to leave, the evening settling around them like a comfortable blanket, Ethan accidentally bumped the television remote while reaching for his jacket. The screen flickered to life on an art documentary, the volume turned up higher than necessary in the way of television sets left unwatched. The narrator spoke in the hushed, reverent tones reserved for discussing great mysteries, the voice of someone sharing secrets too precious for normal conversation. The enigmatic figure known only as MF remains one of the art world's greatest mysteries, the narrator intoned over images of elaborate murals that took Aaron's breath away. The camera panned across walls transformed into windows to other worlds, each piece signed with those same two letters that had puzzled him since childhood trips to museums with his art teacher mother. These works, created over a span of 7 years, commanded millions at auction before their creator vanished completely 5 years ago, leaving behind only questions and a legacy that continues to influence street art worldwide. Aaron watched, mesmerized, as the documentary showed piece after piece of breathtaking complexity, graffiti that transcended its humble origins to become something approaching the divine. The technical skill was undeniable, but it was the emotion in every line that truly impressed him. These weren't decorations or statements. They were prayers painted in color and shadow, each one telling a story of loss and hope, and the stubborn human refusal to surrender to despair. Margaret's face went white as bone china, and she fumbled for the remote with hands that shook like autumn leaves in a strong wind. But Aaron had already seen her reaction, had already noticed the way her breath caught when the camera focused on a particular signature, the way her pupils dilated as if she'd seen a ghost. He looked from the screen to her paint-stained fingernails, to the expensive equipment in her workshop, to the fear in her eyes that seemed to grow larger with each passing second. The pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving began clicking into place with the satisfying precision of well-cut joints in a woodworking project. The blue paint under her fingernails, the professional-grade equipment, the way she'd looked at his amateur sculptures as if they contained something she'd lost. The technical perfection of her work combined with its emotional emptiness. The mysterious letters MF that had decorated gallery walls and commanded millions at auction. "Margaret," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, each word falling into the silence like stones dropped into still water. "Those initials on the screen. MF. That's not just coincidence, is it?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications that would change everything depending on her answer. She clicked off the television with sharp finality, the screen going black with a finality that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet of the workshop. "You should take Ethan home," she said, her voice returning to its familiar professional coldness, like armor being hastily reassembled. The warmth that had characterized their entire evening disappeared, as if it had never existed, replaced by the distant politeness he recognized from their workplace interactions. "It's getting late, and he needs his rest." But the damage was done, the truth hanging in the air between them like smoke from a fire that couldn't be extinguished. They both knew what he suspected, and they both knew there was no going back to the comfortable distance they'd maintained before tonight. The following week passed in awkward silence at work, each day stretching longer than the last as Aaron and Margaret navigated around the elephant in the room with the careful precision of diplomats avoiding a war neither wanted to fight. Margaret returned to her grey suits and severe demeanor with vengeance, avoiding Aaron's gaze in the hallways with the dedication of someone fleeing a crime scene. But he couldn't stop thinking about the woman he'd glimpsed in her workshop, the one who'd knelt to speak with his son and handled his amateur sculptures like precious artifacts worth more than money could measure. The cobalt blue paint under her fingernails haunted his dreams, mixing with images of million-dollar murals signed MF and the fear in her eyes when the documentary had revealed too much truth too quickly. He found himself researching the mysterious artist during his lunch breaks, learning about the sudden disappearance that had shocked the art world and left collectors scrambling for any remaining pieces. The more he read, the more convinced he became that his boss, the woman who'd shared dinner with him and his son, was living under an assumed identity that hid one of the most celebrated artists of the decade. But with certainty came confusion. If Margaret Flynn was really MF, then she was worth more money than most people could imagine, famous in circles that valued creativity above everything else. Why would someone with that kind of success and recognition choose to hide in a small Maine town, working a corporate job that clearly brought her no joy? What kind of pain or fear could drive someone to abandon everything they'd worked for in favor of anonymity and isolation? Aaron's co-workers noticed the tension, of course. In a workplace as small as Coastal Shipyard, changes in routine were as obvious as new haircuts or wedding rings. Margaret's return to rigid professionalism after weeks of unusual warmth didn't go unnoticed, and neither did Aaron's distracted state during meetings and project discussions. But nobody asked direct questions. Workplace politics in small towns required a delicate touch, and everyone understood that some stories were too personal for public consumption. It was Ethan who finally broke the stalemate, as children often do with their gift for cutting through adult complications to reach simple truths. "Can we visit the nice lady again?" he asked one evening, looking up from his homework with hopeful eyes that reminded Aaron so much of Sarah, it sometimes hurt to breathe. "She made me feel special, like my heart doesn't make me different from other kids. And I want to show her the dragon I made at school. Mrs. Patterson said it was the best sculpture in the whole second grade." Aaron felt something crack inside his chest at those words, a fissure in the wall he'd built around his own heart to protect it from further damage. His son, who spent so much time in hospitals and doctors' offices, being treated like a fragile thing that might break at any moment, had connected with Margaret in a way that transcended their different worlds. For a few hours, she'd made him feel normal, valued, seen for who he was rather than what was wrong with him. How could Aaron let his own confusion and fear deny his child that kind of acceptance? The next evening, Aaron found himself standing at Margaret's door again, this time without invitation or excuse, his heart hammering against his ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. The Victorian house looked different in the fading light. More fortress than home, its windows reflecting nothing but his own uncertain expression. He'd rehearsed what he wanted to say during the drive over, but now that he was here, the words seemed inadequate to bridge the gap that had opened between them. Margaret answered wearing paint-splattered clothes that told a story he was beginning to understand. Dark jeans streaked with colors that spoke of hours spent in creative fury. An old t-shirt that had been sacrificed to artistic necessity. Her hair was wild with the kind of chaos that came from running frustrated hands through it repeatedly, and there were smudges of paint on her cheek that she'd clearly forgotten to wash off. Behind her, he could see canvases and supplies scattered across her living room like the aftermath of a creative tornado. She'd been working, creating something new with the kind of desperate intensity he recognized from his own midnight welding sessions. The formal living room had been transformed into an artist's studio, pristine Victorian elegance giving way to the beautiful chaos of active creation. Easels stood at odd angles, holding works in various stages of completion. Paint tubes lay scattered across every surface, their caps missing, colors bleeding together on pallets and rags and whatever flat surface had been pressed into service. "I know who you are," Aaron said quietly, his voice carrying across the space between them like a bridge he wasn't sure could hold their combined weight. The words felt huge and small at the same time, inadequate to encompass the magnitude of what he'd figured out, yet powerful enough to change everything between them. Or at least, I think I do. The paint under your fingernails, the equipment in your workshop, your reaction to that documentary. You're MF, aren't you? Her shoulders sagged, as if a weight she'd been carrying had finally become too heavy to bear alone, the fight going out of her like air from a punctured balloon. For a moment, she looked older than her 42 years, worn down by secrets that had cost more energy to maintain than she'd ever imagined when she first decided to disappear. "Then you know why we can't continue this friendship," she replied, her voice flat with resignation. "Our worlds are too different. I'm not who you think I am, Aaron. I'm not the person you and Ethan deserve to have in your lives. Show me, Aaron said simply, the two words carrying more weight than longer speeches could have managed. He stepped closer to the door, close enough to see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly with what might have been fear or relief or some combination of both. Show me who you really are, Margaret. Let me decide for myself whether our worlds are too different to bridge. After a long moment that stretched between them like a held breath, Margaret stepped aside and let him enter. The pristine Victorian interior had been transformed into something that looked like creativity had exploded in the most beautiful way possible. Canvases lined the walls, some finished, others abandoned mid-creation when inspiration shifted direction. The smell of paint and turpentine filled the air with a richness that spoke of hours spent chasing visions only the artist could see fully. In the center of it all stood an easel holding a work in progress that took Aaron's breath away completely. It was a graffiti-style mural painted on canvas, but calling it graffiti felt like calling the ocean a puddle. The piece depicted a phoenix rising from industrial ashes, its wings formed from the same flowing lines he'd seen in the documentary, but somehow more personal, more urgent. The colors seemed to pulse with life, blues and golds and deep crimsons that suggested fire and rebirth, and the kind of hope that had to be fought for rather than simply wished into existence. In the corner, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, were the initials MF, painted in a style that had become iconic in art circles around the world. But seeing them here, in this context, Aaron understood that they represented more than just a signature. They were a prayer, a promise, a declaration of faith in the power of beauty to transform even the most broken landscapes into something worth preserving. "This is who I really am," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile truth she was finally sharing. Or who I was, anyway. "I'm worth more money than this entire town, Aaron. I could buy and sell the shipyard without thinking twice about the cost. My paintings hang in museums and private collections around the world. Does that change how you see me? Does it make me someone different from the woman who burned your dinner and listened to your son's stories?" Aaron walked slowly around the room, taking in the magnitude of talent surrounding him, like a tourist in a cathedral built from dreams and pigment. These weren't just paintings. They were windows into a soul that had experienced profound beauty and devastating loss, technical mastery married to emotional honesty in ways that most artists spent lifetimes trying to achieve. The skill was undeniable, but it was the raw emotion in every brushstroke that left him speechless, the way each piece seemed to breathe with its own internal rhythm. But more than the artistic achievement, Aaron saw the loneliness embedded in every canvas. These were the works of someone who'd been creating in isolation, pouring their heart onto surfaces that couldn't love them back. For all their technical brilliance, they carried the weight of secrets, the exhaustion that came from maintaining a false identity for years. They were beautiful and heartbreaking in equal measure, like love songs written for an audience that would never hear them. "Why did you stop?" he asked finally, turning from a canvas that seemed to shimmer with its own internal light to face the woman who'd created it. The question felt important, central to understanding not just her art, but the person she'd become in its absence. With talent like this, with success that most artists can only dream of, why did you walk away from it all? Margaret sank into a chair that had been pressed into service as a paint mixing station, suddenly looking older than her 42 years, as if the act of showing her true self had drained her of whatever energy had been keeping her upright. Paint-stained rags were scattered around her feet like fallen petals, and her hands, those expressive hands that could transform blank canvas into worlds of meaning, hung limp at her sides. because I lost the reason I started," she said, her voice carrying the weight of grief that time had softened, but never fully healed. "I began creating art to heal from losing my sister, Sarah. She died of the same heart condition your son has, a hole that couldn't be fixed in time, in her case. But somewhere along the way, between the gallery openings and the million-dollar sales and the critics calling me the voice of a generation, the art became about money and fame instead of memory and love." The revelation hit Aaron like a physical blow, the pieces of her story rearranging themselves into a picture that was both more complex and more heartbreaking than he'd imagined. This woman, worth millions and celebrated around the world, had been carrying the same terror he lived with every day. The fear of losing someone whose heart wasn't strong enough for this world. The irony was brutal and perfect. Success couldn't buy back the dead, or guarantee the safety of the living. "I couldn't feel anything when I painted anymore," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger as she found the courage to tell the truth she'd been hiding for years. "The galleries wanted more MF pieces. Collectors were bidding against each other for works that felt like empty exercises to me. I was going through the motions of being an artist without actually creating anything that mattered. So I painted one final piece, a memorial to Sarah, sold it for $8 million, and disappeared." "That's why you looked at Ethan the way you did," Aaron said, understanding flooding through him like sunrise after the longest night. "When you first saw him, when you talked about his heart condition, you were seeing your sister." The connection between them suddenly made sense. Not just employer and employee finding common ground, but two people who'd learned to carry the same impossible weight. Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face in tracks that caught the studio light like silver threads. "He has her smile," she whispered, her voice breaking on the words. "Her curiosity, her fearlessness despite being fragile. When I saw him playing with your sculptures, talking about dragons and adventures, it was like Sarah was looking at me again. Like she was asking me why I'd stopped creating beauty in a world that needed it so desperately." Aaron knelt beside her chair, taking her paint-stained hands in his calloused ones, the contrast between their textures telling the story of different kinds of work in service of the same human need to create meaning from chaos. "You said you lost the reason you started painting," he said softly, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "But maybe you found a new reason. Maybe that's what this is. Not about replacing what you lost, but about honoring it by choosing to love again." Margaret's eyes searched his face, hope and disbelief warring in her expression like opposing armies fighting for the same territory. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the sound of rain that had begun to fall against the windows, the same November rain that had brought them together in the first place. "I'm saying that Ethan lights up when he talks about you," Aaron said, his words carrying the weight of absolute truth. "I'm saying that when you showed interest in my metal scraps, it was the first time I'd thought of them as more than therapy for grief. Maybe we're supposed to heal each other's broken hearts. Maybe that's what art is really for. Not to make us rich or famous, but to help us remember how to love, despite the risk of losing everything again." For a moment, the possibility hung between them like morning mist. Beautiful but fragile, something that could be destroyed by too much examination, or dispersed by the first strong wind of doubt. Margaret's hands tightened in his grip, her paint-stained fingers intertwining with his scarred ones in a gesture that felt like a promise neither of them was quite ready to make out loud. Then reality crashed back in waves that threatened to drown the fragile hope they'd been building together. "You don't understand," Margaret said, pulling her hands away with obvious reluctance. "The art world doesn't just let you disappear, Aaron. There are people who've been looking for MF for 5 years. Collectors, gallery owners, reporters who think they can make their careers by solving the mystery of where I went." She stood abruptly, pacing to the window where rain streaked the glass in patterns that looked like tears on a giant's face. "If they find out where I am, this peaceful life I've built will be destroyed. And your life, Ethan's life, will be destroyed with it. The paparazzi, the constant attention, the way everything you do becomes public property." She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, her breath fogging the surface in irregular patterns. "You work with your hands for honest wages," she continued, her voice muffled, but no less intense for the barrier between them. "You've built a good life on your own terms, raising your son with dignity and love. I hide behind a fake identity while sitting on a fortune I don't deserve, money made from turning my sister's memory into commodity art. We're not the same, Aaron. We can't be." "Maybe we're not," Aaron said, rising to face her across the room that suddenly felt vast despite being filled with evidence of her talent. "Maybe you're right that our worlds are too different to bridge. But that doesn't change what I saw in your workshop last week. It doesn't change how you looked at my son, or how you looked at my art. Money doesn't make someone a different species, Margaret. It just gives them different problems to solve." But even as he spoke the words, Aaron felt the gulf between them widening like a crack in ice that had seemed solid moments before. How could a single dad from a trailer park build a life with a woman who could buy anything she wanted except the peace she craved? How could he offer her anything that her millions couldn't purchase more efficiently? The mathematics of their situation seemed impossible, no matter how he tried to balance the equation. Their argument was building to a crescendo that neither wanted, but both seemed powerless to prevent when Aaron's phone buzzed with the urgent rhythm that meant emergency. Dr. Rebecca Hayes' name appeared on the screen, and Aaron's heart immediately shifted into the elevated rhythm of panic that had become too familiar over the years. He answered with hands that shook slightly, Margaret moving closer to offer support, despite the emotional distance that had opened between them. "Aaron, I need to see you and Ethan first thing tomorrow morning," Dr. Hayes said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality that medical professionals used when delivering news that could change everything. "His latest tests show some concerning changes. The surgery we've been discussing. We can't wait much longer. I'm thinking we need to schedule it within the next few weeks." The words hit Aaron like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and making his vision narrow to a single terrifying focus. Weeks, not months. The surgery that would cost $150,000. Money he didn't have despite working every overtime shift available and mortgaging everything he owned just to cover Ethan's regular medical expenses. His insurance would cover some of it, but not nearly enough to bridge the gap between necessity and possibility. Margaret stood beside him in the hospital hallway the next morning, listening to every word Dr. Hayes spoke with an expression Aaron couldn't read. She'd appeared at his trailer before dawn, dressed in her business clothes but carrying a notebook and pen like a student preparing for the most important exam of her life. When Dr. Hayes finished explaining the urgency of Ethan's condition, the narrow window they had to work with, and the risks of waiting any longer, Margaret asked quiet, probing questions that showed she understood both the medical and financial implications of what they were facing. She took notes in her careful handwriting, her business training evident in how she processed complex medical information and translated it into actionable items. Aaron felt simultaneously grateful for her presence and ashamed of his inability to provide what his son needed without help. Every father's worst fear was playing out in real time. Having all the love in the world but lacking the means to save his child's life. Dr. Hayes was gentle but direct about the financial reality they faced. The surgery itself is complex, requiring a team of specialists and several days in intensive care afterward. With Ethan's particular condition, we're looking at costs in the range of $150,000. I know that's a staggering amount, but this repair will give him a completely normal life. He'll be able to run and play and do everything other children do without restriction. Was that night, after tucking a worried Ethan into bed with promises that everything would be fine, promises Aaron wasn't sure he could keep, he sat at his kitchen table with a calculator and a pile of bills that seemed to grow larger every time he shuffled through them. No matter how he ran the numbers, adjusting for overtime and potential loans and selling everything he owned that had any value, he came up dramatically short. He could work double shifts for the next 5 years and still not cover the medical costs his son needed to survive. The weight of failure pressed down on his shoulders like a physical thing, heavier than any steel beam he'd ever lifted at the shipyard. He'd survived losing Sarah, had rebuilt a life from nothing when grief threatened to destroy everything worth preserving. But this felt insurmountable, a wall too high to climb and too wide to go around. How did you tell your child that love wasn't enough, that sometimes the mathematics of survival came down to numbers that didn't add up no matter how desperately you needed them to? A soft knock at his door interrupted his spiral of despair, gentle but persistent like rain on a roof. Margaret stood on his porch holding a thermos of coffee and wearing an expression of quiet determination that reminded him why she'd been successful in business long before she'd become famous as an artist. She looked like someone who'd spent the night making difficult decisions, her eyes red-rimmed but resolute. "I made some calls," she said without preamble, setting the thermos on his kitchen table and opening a folder she'd brought with her. "Dr. Hayes is willing to perform the surgery next week if we can guarantee payment. I've also contacted the best pediatric cardiac recovery team in Boston. They'll oversee Ethan's rehabilitation to ensure he has the best possible outcome." Aaron's pride flared immediately, hot and defensive and entirely predictable. "Margaret, I told you, I don't need charity. I'll figure something out. I always do." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were more hope than reality. There was no magical solution waiting to be discovered, no hidden resources he hadn't already exhausted in his calculations. Margaret shook her head firmly, her voice taking on the confident tone she used in business meetings when she needed to convince people to take risks they weren't sure they could afford. "It's not charity, Aaron. It's an investment in something more valuable than money." Then she set a folder on his kitchen table and opened it to reveal documents that looked official and complicated, covered in language he didn't immediately understand. "I want to commission a series of sculptures from you," Margaret explained, pointing to specific clauses in the contract she'd apparently spent the night drafting. 20 pieces, incorporating both our styles, your intuitive metalwork combined with my understanding of color theory and composition. We'll market them as a collaboration between MF and an anonymous partner whose identity will be revealed gradually as the pieces gain recognition. Aaron stared at the papers, his mind reeling with the implications of what she was proposing. The numbers written in neat columns seemed impossible, more money than he'd seen in his entire life, represented as casually as grocery lists. "You're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "No one pays that much for art from someone who's never sold a piece, who doesn't have any training or credentials or gallery representation." "They do when MF endorses the work," Margaret said quietly, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made him believe she understood exactly what she was offering and why. "And they'll pay even more when they realize the anonymous partner has raw talent that can't be taught in any school. Aaron, I've been looking for a reason to create again for 5 years. You and Ethan, you're my reason. Let me help save his life, and maybe you'll help save mine in return." The offer hung between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond the immediate crisis they were trying to solve. Accepting meant stepping into Margaret's world, becoming part of the art scene she'd fled from, risking exposure to the kind of attention that could destroy the quiet life he'd built for himself and his son. It meant trusting someone whose own relationship with fame and money had been complicated enough to drive her into hiding. But it also meant Ethan would live. It meant his son would have the surgery that would repair his heart and give him the normal childhood that every parent wanted for their child. "What if they figure out who you really are?" Aaron asked, his voice rough with emotion. "What if this brings the chaos you've been hiding from right to our doorstep? What if helping us destroys the peace you've found here?" Margaret's smile was sad but resolved, the expression of someone who'd already counted the cost and decided it was worth paying. "Then we'll face it together," she said simply. "But Ethan's life is worth the risk, isn't it? Some things are more important than anonymity or comfort. Some things are worth fighting for, even if the fight changes everything about the life you thought you wanted." 2 weeks later, Ethan Walsh lay in a hospital bed that seemed too large for his small frame, his chest rising and falling under the influence of anesthesia that would keep him comfortable while skilled hands repaired the hole in his heart. The surgery had lasted 6 hours, each minute stretching like an eternity for Aaron and Margaret, who'd maintained their vigil in the waiting room with coffee that grew cold and magazines that went unread. Dr. Rebecca Hayes emerged from the operating room with a smile that told Aaron everything he needed to know before she spoke a word. Her surgical scrubs were rumpled and her hair was escaping from its professional bun, but her eyes were bright with the satisfaction that came from a job done perfectly. "The repair was flawless," she said, squeezing Aaron's shoulder with hands that had just performed a miracle. "We were able to close the defect completely, and his heart function is already showing improvement. He's going to live a completely normal life, Aaron. No restrictions, no limitations, no more midnight worry sessions about whether his heart is strong enough for tomorrow." Aaron collapsed into a waiting room chair, 5 years of constant worry finally lifting from his shoulders like a weight he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. The relief was so overwhelming it felt like drowning in reverse, like surfacing after years underwater to discover that breathing was still possible. Margaret had been there through everything. The pre-surgery anxiety, the endless hours of waiting, the moment when Ethan opened his eyes and asked for ice cream with the casual confidence of a child who'd never doubted that the adults in his life would take care of whatever needed taking care of. She held Aaron when he finally broke down and cried tears of relief that had been building for years, her own eyes bright with moisture as she watched the man she'd come to love discover that sometimes the impossible mathematics of parenthood did add up after all. She was the first person Ethan smiled at when the breathing tube was removed, the first person he wanted to show his surgical scar to, the first person he asked to sign his cast when they moved him to a regular room for recovery. Watching her with his son, Aaron realized that somewhere along the way, they'd stopped being employer and employee, artist and welder, rich woman and poor man struggling to bridge the gap between their different worlds. They'd become something more precious and more fragile, a family that had chosen each other despite all the logical reasons why their relationship shouldn't work. They were 3 people who'd learned that love was more powerful than fear, even when fear had logic and experience on its side. The collaboration had been everything Margaret promised and more. Working together in her workshop, combining his intuitive understanding of metal with her sophisticated knowledge of color and form, they'd created pieces that neither could have made alone. The art world's response had been electric, mysterious works that bore MF's signature. Alongside someone known only as A.W., had collectors bidding frantically for pieces that wouldn't be revealed until the official exhibition. But more important than the money or recognition was what creating together had done for both of them. Margaret found her artistic voice again, not the desperate therapy of grief, but the joyful expression of hope that came from choosing to love despite the risk of loss. Aaron discovered that his late-night welding sessions had always been art, that his hands could shape beauty as easily as they shaped the steel hulls that kept ships afloat. Together, they built something neither had thought possible, a future that honored their pasts while embracing something entirely new. The revelation of their partnership had indeed brought attention to Maplewood, but not the destructive kind Margaret had feared. Art critics spoke respectfully of MF's return to public life, and the story of the single father whose raw talent had inspired one of the world's most celebrated artists became a symbol of hope rather than a source of scandal. Gallery owners called with offers, but Aaron and Margaret were selective, choosing only opportunities that felt authentic to their shared vision. One evening, 6 months after Ethan's surgery, Aaron found Margaret in their shared workshop putting finishing touches on their latest piece. Their latest piece. The possessive pronoun felt natural now, though they still hadn't defined exactly what they were to each other, beyond partners in art and life. Ethan was outside, playing with the boundless energy of a completely healthy child, his laughter floating through the open windows like music, composed specifically for parents who'd learned not to take such sounds for granted. "Do you ever regret it?" Aaron asked, settling beside her at the workbench where they'd spent countless hours discovering how their different talents could complement each other. "Giving up your anonymity, letting the world find MF again? Trading the quiet life you'd built for all this complexity?" He gestured toward the workshop, which now contained evidence of their collaboration. Dozens of pieces in various stages of completion, a fusion of industrial strength and artistic vision that had captured the attention of galleries worldwide. Margaret set down her brush and looked at him with eyes that held none of the fear or sadness he'd seen that first drunken night at the office party. The workshop around them was filled with the comfortable chaos of active creation. Coffee cups from their morning conversations, Ethan's drawings taped to the walls, the pleasant disorder of a space shared by people who'd learned to trust each other completely. "The world never found MF," she said quietly. "MF died 5 years ago when I lost the ability to feel anything while creating. What they found was Margaret Flynn, who learned to love art again because a welder showed her that beauty doesn't require a price tag." She gestured toward the window where Ethan was building elaborate structures with scraps of metal, his small hands moving with the same intuitive understanding that had always guided Aaron's work. "He's going to be an artist too, you know," she said, watching the boy create with the complete absorption that characterized all his activities. "Different from both of us, but an artist nonetheless. Someone who understands that the most important creations are the ones that help people remember how to love each other." Aaron watched his son create with the fearless confidence of someone whose heart had been repaired in every sense that mattered, whose future was unlimited by the defect that had shadowed his early years. "He's going to have choices we never had," Aaron said, his voice warm with the satisfaction that came from providing opportunities rather than just survival. "He'll never have to choose between art and security, between following his dreams and taking care of the people he loves." Margaret took his hand, her fingers still stained with paint, despite years of trying to scrub them clean, the marks of her trade as permanent and honorable as the scars on Aaron's hands from his years of honest work. "That's what we're really creating," she said, watching Ethan discover something new in the metal scraps that made him laugh with delight. Not just sculptures or paintings, but possibilities. A world where people don't have to choose between love and security, where talent doesn't have to be sacrificed to necessity. The workshop around them held evidence of their collaboration, dozens of pieces that told the story of two people learning to trust each other, learning to combine their different strengths into something more powerful than either could achieve alone. But it also held something more precious than art, the comfortable accumulation of shared life. Coffee cups from their morning conversations about everything and nothing. Ethan's drawings taped to the walls beside sketches for their next project. The pleasant chaos of a space that belonged to people who'd learned that love was worth the risk of loss. As the sun set over Maplewood Harbor, painting the workshop in shades of gold and amber that reminded Aaron of the first time he'd seen Margaret's true work, he realized they'd built exactly what she'd promised that desperate night in the hospital. Not charity, not rescue, but investment. In each other, in art, in the possibility that broken things could be made beautiful again without losing the strength that came from having survived being broken in the first place. Outside, Ethan called for them to come see his latest creation, his voice bright with the excitement of discovery that had become the soundtrack of their shared life. They went together, hands linked, hearts full, toward whatever masterpiece he'd discovered in the scraps of their collective past, ready to help him build whatever future his strong heart could dream into existence.